But I am here because the story of the Dutch referendum and the way that the politics around the referendum are developing in Ukraine are, to me, so outrageous and so shocking that I accepted the invitation to come here and speak about it. So this is, I think, right now, the only country in Europe which has actually shed blood for the European ideal. In February of 2014, starting in November of 2013, when a Ukrainian, profoundly corrupt and undemocratic Ukrainian president tried to take the agreement away from Ukraine, younger Ukrainians, and not only younger, a whole generation of several generations of Ukrainians went out on the street. They defended a set of ideas and ideals. They thought they were fighting against corruption, for the rule of law, for a more open society, for the right to be part of Europe in a cultural sense. I don't think anybody in Ukraine imagines they'll join the European Union anytime soon, but to become part of the European continent in a deeper way. They fought for that. Some of them died for it. They waved European flags on the square of central Kiev. And when their president finally ran away, literally fleeing the country, out of fear of the size of the rebellion, I've watched them try and put the country together again and put it back on a European course. And it hasn't been entirely successful. It goes up and down. As I said, there's a long history of trauma there. There's 100 years of dictatorship that have to be overcome, and therefore ways of thinking and behaving that have to be changed. But when you add up what's been done, when you look at the pockets of success, when you look at the young people creating new television stations and founding new businesses, all you can do is admire them and think, wow, this is something that we have to help. And to discover that, in the Netherlands, that story hasn't been told and isn't well understood, and that a very peculiar referendum with odd origins is about to be voted on that seeks to deny Ukrainians an agreement which for them represents rule of law, democracy, trade, and prosperity, seems to me just extraordinary. I'm hoping maybe you'll tell me in the course of the conversation what's happened inside Dutch society. A vote for this referendum is a vote for rule of law, and a vote against it is a vote for chaos, war, and violence, of a kind that you know perfectly well, because that was it was that kind of disorder and that kind of catastrophe that brought down the plane that killed so many of your citizens 2 years ago. Why would the Dutch, of all people, vote for chaos, which is in effect what you're doing if you vote against an agreement that Ukrainians hope will build a deeper relationship to Europe? One of the things that I work on when I'm not working on Ukraine, I've spent a lot of time over the last couple of years doing, is trying to understand, and at a small think tank that I work in London, trying to track and monitor and get a better insight into the nature of modern disinformation. We look at not only we look at we've looked at ISIS, we've looked at China, but of course one of my primary concerns has been Russian disinformation. How does it work? What's the nature of it in the modern world? It's obviously we're not in the Cold War anymore, and the kinds of disinformation that Russia puts out is no longer the same thing as Soviet propaganda of the olden days. Most of the time, Russia doesn't try to promote itself or say Russia is great. Instead, what it's trying to do is it's trying to undermine others. It tries to undermine the European Union. It's trying to undermine the democracy in Ukraine. It's trying to undermine institutions which the Kremlin feels to be a threat to its authority and its power in Russia. And the only thing I can conclude in my attempt to understand what's going on here is that Russian disinformation has been incredibly effective here, which is quite shocking in a stable Western European country with a long tradition of democracy, famous journalists and reputable media. How did this happen? Maybe you'll be able to tell me in the next 45 minutes. I hope so. No, it's much more complicated than that. So Ukraine is a bilingual country. and it's genuinely bilingual. I had this conversation this morning with the Ukrainian ambassador who was switching between Ukrainian and Russian on the phone. And he says, well, when people speak Russian to me, I speak back Russian. When they speak Ukrainian, I speak Ukrainian. Most people in the country speak both languages. I've been to public meetings in Kiev like this one, where people get up and one person speaks one and then the other speaks the other. I'd say 95% of people understand both. And so it's deeply bilingual in a way that actually, you know, this is something Americans find very hard to understand, but Europeans should be able to understand. There are other bilingual countries in Europe, and there are other places where people speak more than one language very easily. There is a divide in Ukraine, but the divide isn't linguistic and it isn't national. There is a civilizational argument. But what's really happened in Ukraine, what began, the first sign of it was the Orange Revolution in 2004. And since 2014, you've seen this even more strongly, is this civilizational divide begins to disappear. And there's more and more unified feeling that we would like to be part of the West. And by this, once again, for the third time, it doesn't mean they're going to be in the EU or they're going to be in NATO, but they would like to be part of Western civilization. They would like a relationship with the West. And there is, you would have a hard time now finding in Kiev lots of, or throughout most of Ukraine, lots of people who feel really strongly against this association agreement. I mean, this is very much a policy of the government, you know, by the elected politicians. It's actually been the policy of every government. It was just that Yanukovych's government was temporarily bribed into turning it down. He said, all right, I'm not signing it. And this is when you had a mass protest of a kind that really was quite extraordinary and which lasted for many weeks. So there was really large and broad national support for what is, in fact, a trade agreement of a kind that the EU has with many other countries. It has with Algeria, it has with Turkey, it has with many others. But for the Ukrainians, it has enormous symbolic significance. You know, this is a trade agreement, okay, it's about sort of raspberry quotas. And so that people would, you know, stand on the streets for days and days and days for that. You know, this tells you how important Europe is symbolically and culturally for Ukrainians.
Yes, it's a trade agreement, but to Ukrainians it's much more.
Yes, because it represents to Ukrainians the overcoming of this civilizational divide. You know, we want to be part of Western civilization. And again, by that, they don't mean they want to be in the EU. They mean they want Western rule of law. They want to end the rule of corrupt oligarchs. Yeah. They want accountability. They want democracy. They want their politicians to listen to them. And they don't want to be, you know, treated like slaves or like citizens of an authoritarian dictatorship. So there is a tiny far right in Ukraine, which did very badly in the last elections. And I would guess, and I don't think it's even a guess, I think we could do it statistically, that it's a lot smaller than the fascist fringe here. You know, the existence of far-right parties is now a cross-European phenomenon. It's very strong in France. It's growing in Germany. It's incredibly strong in Hungary. It exists even in some places where you couldn't have imagined it a few years ago, like Sweden. You know, the fact is that in Ukraine, it's less influential and less important there than it is in many Western European countries. And there are, you know, extremist groups who fight with the Ukrainian army, but they don't run the country, they don't dictate policy, they don't control politics, they don't have a role in the political debate in Kiev. You know, I think you would discover if the Netherlands were to go to war against, I don't know, the Belgians, you would find extreme.
We did actually.
You did, right? Okay. Well, if you were to do it again, if you were to do it again, you would discover that on both sides of the border, you would have a rise in violent extremism, because that's what wars do. And one of the other reasons why Ukraine would like to be associated with the West and part of the West is that it doesn't want wars like this. It would like to be a stronger country. It would like to be a more prosperous country. What's the way to become more prosperous? You need to trade, you need to develop, you need investment, you need political stability. And it's only by having trade and investment and political stability that they will be able to withstand another invasion of the kind they had in 2014. You know, if you want the extremism to end, and as I say, you should maybe think about ending it here as well. But if you want extremism to end in Ukraine, then the way to do it is to trade with Ukraine and to ensure Ukraine's prosperity and stability. You know, we now live in a global world, and we have airplanes, and we have the internet, and we have cyber warfare. And, you know, it's no longer possible to say, right, we're Dutch and we live here and we can build walls all around us and we can keep other people out and other ideas out and they can live over there and they're not our problem. No, it's, you know, Ukraine is your problem whether you want it to be or not. You know, and by the way, so is Syria, but we can talk about that another time. The Russian government has now made clear that it doesn't feel bound by sort of 50-year tradition, including a post-Cold War tradition, Cold War and post-Cold War tradition of not moving boundaries in Europe. It's made clear that it isn't bothered by that. It doesn't mind doing that. As I say, it's been conducting very aggressive information campaigns and political financing campaigns in its neighboring countries and also in Western Europe. You know, it's showing that it doesn't respect, you know, the kinds of boundaries that we have come to expect in Europe. And so, yes, I think you have to take seriously the idea that they might at some later stage want to expand the war. They decided not to 2 years ago. They decided to confine it to Donbass. But it's not inconceivable that it could be expanded further in the future. And you know, the Ukrainian revival that took place in the early 1990s and the ones that have periodically risen their heads again since then have often been not openly, I mean, you can't be anti-Soviet anymore, but have been very much an attempt to put back together the society. I mean, it's not an accident that they talk about civil society so much in Ukraine. This wasn't something that we imported. Civil society was the thing that the Soviet Union destroyed. And thus, civil society is the thing that's missing there, and in Russia, actually. And by civil society, I mean all kinds of organizations, all kinds of non-government institutions, all kinds of independent movements and independent ways of thinking. And putting that back together again is part of what the Orange Revolution was about, and it's part of what the Maidan was about in 2014. So again, we see an anti-government protest, but Ukrainians experience that, as I say, it was much deeper than what you saw in the square. It was all kinds of people working together and, you know, new television stations being created right for that moment. There's a famous online television station that began and was launched during the protests, which is now trying to establish itself as one of the main TV stations in Ukraine. So these have been really civic movements more than anything else, and they are civic movements designed to address the damage that was done to the country during the 20th century. Yes, so I tried to make a few months ago, a year or two, I tried to make a perverse argument about Ukraine in the context of this discussion and debate about nationalism and patriotism. And I argued that the real problem in Ukraine, my experience in Ukraine over 2 decades, is not that Ukraine is full of fascists and full of nationalists. I mean, there are a few, and you know, they've been quite visible at times. The real problem is the lack of nationalism and the lack of national identity, which makes people cynical. It makes people corrupt. You know, if you don't feel any loyalty to your state and you don't feel that these people who run you have anything to do with you and you don't care really what happens to them, then you're in a situation, well, okay, I can cheat my neighbor and I can break the law because these aren't really my laws and I don't care. So, you know, we again, in Western Europe, we often forget that our societies came, you know, when we became democracies at a moment when our national identity was very strong and important, and you know, one of the reasons why democracy works in a place like the Netherlands is that people feel some loyalty to their country, so they participate in politics, so they vote in elections, they I don't know, you go and cheer your football team. I mean, you know, people participate in public life because they feel part of a society. And if you actually had a situation in Ukraine in the early 1990s where lots of people didn't particularly feel part of what was going on, that, you know, the Soviets left and some corrupt guys took over and we didn't really know who they are, and, you know, the voting system was a little strange and people didn't feel an attachment to the country. And that was part of why it was as weak as it was for so long. And one of the other things that's changing, I wouldn't say everywhere in Ukraine, but you can certainly feel it in Kiev and the central and western part of the country, and even Odessa, you can feel people beginning to feel, wait, this is my country, I care what happens to it. I'm going to vote in the elections, I'm going to participate in the political process because, I belong here and I'm part of it. And it's when people don't have that feeling that you have, you get social breakdown. First of all, we aren't poking our noses. It's the Ukrainians who have asked for this agreement, and the Ukrainians who've negotiated it, and the Ukrainians who want the relationship with Europe. Nobody in the EU is forcing Ukraine to have a trade agreement. There's no constituency for that. And the EU actually, my recollection of events, which is quite clear, is that the Maidan demonstrations and this waving of EU flags and so on came as a total shock to the European Union, which was completely unprepared for it and had no idea it was coming, and had no, certainly at the highest levels, the European Commission and so on, was unprepared for it. So far from imposing Europe on Ukraine, what we see is something quite different. We see the Ukrainians clamoring to be part of Europe, or not part of Europe, but part of the broader, by definition, European civilization. And we see surprised Europeans not knowing what to do, or in the case of many in the Netherlands, wanting to reject them. So I didn't see where this idea of European colonialism is coming from.
That's actually the word which is used, yes, often.
This is a country which is trying to escape from 300 years of Russian colonialism.
Right.
Which is what's happening in front of our eyes.
It's a Russian influence sphere anyway. We should not provoke them. It's only.
I'm not even sure I understand the argument. So we've had for 20 years.
I'm not too sure myself, but
okay. So I'm just saying, for 20 years, we've had a situation where people. I sometimes hear people say, "Well, shouldn't Ukraine be Finlandized, or shouldn't it be a bridge between East and West?"
Yeah,
well,
Central Europe.
That's what it's
Europa,
been. That is actually the role that it has played for the last 25 years. It is that. It has been a bridge. It has been neither East nor West. It has not had its own identity. And what has been the result? As I say, profound corruption, cynicism, and now, the emergence of violence in the East. It has not been successful to have Ukraine as a sort of, playground for Russian oligarchs. That has been an unsuccessful model. It hasn't worked for Ukraine. It hasn't been good for Ukraine's neighbors. It hasn't made Ukraine rich, and it hasn't made Ukraine stable. So we've done that experiment, and it didn't succeed. It did not work. And so what Ukraine would like now is something different. I mean, I think the Russian problem is I would put it a little bit differently. So yes, I do think Putin fears the West, or is concerned about the West as such. But I don't think it's a military concern. All he has to do is look at how many American tanks there are in Europe and note that a few years ago, actually, there were none. Now they've brought a few back, although not very many. What Putin is afraid of, and this is true, he is afraid of the West as a successful set of institutions, which could be attractive to Russians. So he is afraid of Western democracy, and he is afraid of Western prosperity, and he is afraid of Western culture, because these things are strong. When these things are strong, they are attractive to Russians.
And they threaten his rule.
And they threaten his rule, which is authoritarian and nepotistic and kleptocratic and based on a system of corrupt relationships, which is, yes, it is a different system from ours. And so, yes, he's worried that his form of corruption can be undermined if people in his country feel attracted to something else. And this, of course, is why Maidan was so threatening, because that is his nightmare, that, people waving European flags in Red Square.
Yeah.
That, yes, he's worried about it, but he's not worried about it because it's a danger to his country. It would be good for his country. And he's worried about it because it's a danger to him,
for him, though,
and his friends, who are in control of the levers of power in Russia right now. But let's think about, and incidentally, his reaction, unlike ours, has not been to say, okay, I don't want these ideas, I'm building walls and I'm not letting people in. No, his reaction has been aggressive. So his reaction to what this perceived threat of the West has been to try to undermine the West. And how does he do that? This is
this is what you've been studying at the Legatum Institute. You were just mentioning. I was going to get back to that.
He is funding anti-European political parties in the West, either funding or advising or helping in other ways. I mean, we know about Marine Le Pen and we know about Jobbik in Hungary, but he has strong relationships with other anti-European parties, both of the far right and the far left, in almost all European countries. He funds media operations in every Western country, including both social media and standard media. He funds think tanks and websites which promote Russian ideas. Not that they promote Russian ideas, but they attempt to undermine European ideas, anti-EU, anti-NATO, anti-American, in some countries anti-establishment. And he also works through the business community looking for links to powerful companies who can promote, his view of the world inside the halls of power. And different aspects of this work differently in different countries. The relationship with rich people works very well in Italy.
Around Berlusconi.
Yeah, and not only, but so it's not the same tactic everywhere. But the funding of and the support for anti-European movements is something he does in every country. The point of NATO is that it is not an aggressive organization, it's a deterrent. Mm-hmm. And that's what it's always been. It's not there to invade Russia. We have no interest in doing that. It's there to prevent Russia from invading us. And theoretically, it still does that. And so, yes, it needs some weapons, and it's historically had a large American presence to reinforce it, as a way of preventing Russia and others, if need be, from attacking a NATO member. So no, I don't think you can get rid of all the militaries yet altogether, because no, there is still a theoretical military threat that exists and hasn't gone away.
No, so we should not get rid of it. We should maybe buy a little bit more of it.
I think it would. I think in the coming years we are not moving into a more stable period of history, and we are not moving into a more peaceful era of history.
That would be fair. Probably
and
too.
What you want to be is able to deter violence and to deter attack.
I mean, you would think, though, that it would be nice to have 45 million people more on the European side of history. Than
so, in that sense, yes. If you're worried about, a military or other kind of threat from Russia, then what you really want is a stable and prosperous and relatively integrated Ukraine on your eastern border. That's one of the best guarantees for European peace and European security that you can have.
Yeah.
Well, and Applebaum has asked not only me but also the audience to explain to her. She asked it more or less rhetorically, why we're having this absurd referendum on the 6th of April. But we have it, and we have to fight for a positive outcome, which is not a guarantee. And why we have to fight for it, I think, because the Dutch citizen, like many citizens in Europe and in the US, I should add, is angry. The Dutch citizen is angry. The American citizen is angry. And there's a saying in the English language which reads, fear breeds proximity. Uncertainty breeds proximity. When people fear and are uncertain, and they are uncertain in Europe about migration, about a potential Brexit, about the financial crisis which has not seen a solution, they are going to focus on their region, on their city, on their nation. And that's, I think, one of the backgrounds of nationalism you have spoken about. Secondly, I see in Europe the political middle ground growing weaker and the fringes growing stronger. That has to do with that angry citizen, because the fringes are playing on that angry citizen. Is this referendum about Ukraine? I doubt it. I doubt it. It's a referendum where people can say no, and saying no in the referendum is much easier than say yes, because if you say no, you need less arguments than when you say yes. That's why the yes campaign in this country still has to make a lot of ground. I'm against referenda, let me make myself clear, and a consultative referendum is a contradiction in terms, Yuri. It's a contradiction in terms. What do you say in a consultative referendum? You say to the people, you can vote, But I keep the political margin after you have voted to go the other way, which I hope the government will do in the unholy situation that it would become a no. Geopolitical, Yuri, you asked, but I think I needed this introduction, but with the help of the audience, as Applebaum was already said, because that will be first and foremost on their minds. I think the geopolitical element in this whole discussion, but you said it in other words, I'd rather see, and there are lots of Putin versteher in this part of Europe, I see much rather a Ukraine which develops itself economically, politically, like Poland has developed. And I think Putin is very afraid that Ukrainians want to become Poles. Ukrainians want to become Poles. As soon as Ukrainians have become Poles, because they have the rule of law, they have good governance, they do not have corruption anymore, Putin really has to fear that will infect his own system in Russia. So I think Putin at this stage
because the democracy of the Poles has infected Ukraine.
And I think Putin is afraid that this will happen. This is not about NATO. I mean, it was about NATO in 2008 and the invasion into Georgia in August 2008. It is now, of course, much more for this virus of governance and this virus of the rule of law, which Vladimir Putin doesn't like. On the military side and on the NATO side, I think the conclusion should be that when the wall fell in 1989, we in Western Europe have taken a geopolitical holiday which lasts till this very day.
You mean, and what do you mean with that holiday?
Geopolitical holiday. Well, there was Pax Americana, the wall had fallen, we have cashed the peace dividend between 1989
and Americans were
2015.
paying for the army. And
we have so much diminished and cut on our budgets of defense that it is now impossible, as we saw in Libya, as we see elsewhere, to wage any serious military operation without the help of the United States of America. Read Obama's Atlantic interview. The difference, I think, between Barack Obama in the Syrian case and Putin is that Obama did not enforce his red line and Putin will enforce his red lines. And that's why also for me the key word is deterrence. We should deter Putin of doing anything stupid vis-à-vis the Baltics, launching a kind of hybrid warfare, which he did rather successfully in Crimea. We have majority Russian cities, as everybody knows, in Estonia, in Latvia. NATO should beef up its deterrence. I'm happy and glad that the Americans, Ash Carter, the Secretary of Defense, decided to invest more in pre-positioning equipment. But there is a European responsibility as well here. And then I come back to my Putin versteher. There are too many people, too many for my liking, who say, but we shouldn't provoke the guy. Why should we provoke him? We shouldn't provoke him, we should deter. And I can tell you, and Applebaum can tell us, including me, much better than I can, that from the comfort of The Hague, or Rotterdam, or Paris for that matter, when you live in Tallinn, or you live in Riga, or you live in Vilnius, or you live in Warsaw for that matter, given the history, that threat is there. Look at the Finns and the Swedes and their discussion on coming closer to NATO. The Hague is comfortable, Amsterdam is comfortable, but also NATO, in its Warsaw summit, by the way, which is the next summit of NATO, should take this well into consideration. So yes, there is a geopolitical argument. Yes, there is an argument on deterrence. And let me finish, not to concern the audience, but the more we continue in neglecting our conventional defense, the more we lower the nuclear threshold. Putin has restarted the nuclear debate. During and after Crimea, Putin has positioned missiles in the exclave of Kaliningrad, missiles near the Black Sea, missiles in the Eastern Mediterranean. NATO should answer. And that is not warmongering, that is simply the word deterrence. The word deterrence we know from the Cold War. We don't like the word deterrence, but that's what it's all about. So I couldn't agree more with that remark Applebaum just made. Well, I think we've never said we would allow Ukraine in, and with the Central and Eastern European countries, with the Baltics, it has always been, and Applebaum said it a moment ago, why should we deny them the right of being part of the European family? What arguments do we have to tell them, no, you should not? You should not.
Well, because we might be afraid of Putin, for instance.
Well, I mean, we have taken these decisions. When I started at NATO in 2004, NATO was 19. When I left, it was 28. So that was indeed a huge. We should take into consideration that there is a perception in Russia, not only by Vladimir Putin, that expansion has gone rather quickly, but we have the NATO-Russia Council for that. We have all kinds of possibilities to keep the communication channels open. But we can't say, and I will never say, that enlargement of NATO and enlargement of the European Union was the wrong decision, and we shouldn't have done that.
What enlargement did was it expanded the zone of peace and security into Europeans East, into a region of Europe that had been the source, really, frankly, of 2 world wars, fight over territories there, and meant that the kind of disturbance we've seen in Ukraine in the last few years happens in Ukraine and not in the Czech Republic. You know, we've expanded our eastern border of safety and security, you know, that much farther to the east. Look, Putin was, the Russians at the time never objected to the expansion of NATO in any serious way. If Putin wanted a real relationship with NATO, a real one based on an understanding and an acceptance of NATO's ideals and, you know, European values, he would have had one a long time ago. It's been offered to him in various forms at different times. He hasn't taken it, and the reason why he hasn't taken it is because this problem of values is a real one. You know, he has a different kind of political system. His political system depends on violence. It depends on locking up dissidents. It depends on occasionally murdering them. It depends on the suppression of the media. It depends on this extraordinary production of disinformation and emotion and hysteria, which you have in the Russian media. These are all things that, you know, we find difficult to get along with. What would be the way to have peace in Europe would be a Russia which looked more like us and spoke more like us. Unfortunately, we don't have that. But the idea that by expanding the zone of corruption closer to us, that will make us safer, is absurd. You're not. Why? I mean, you know, the way in which corruption will grow if Ukraine is a vacuum, and then you'll have these these companies that try and that hide in tax havens all over Europe, which actually they do anyway. It's another subject. But having a Ukraine in which there's more rule of law will reduce corruption. You're associated with Turkey, and Turkey's at war, and you're associated with Algeria, and they're at war, and you're associated with, I don't know, dozens of other countries around the world that you have trade agreements with, and some of them are having wars or they have local conflicts. I mean, I didn't see that that's an argument against it. And in any case, you know, once again, I'm again repeating myself, but the expansion of trade with Ukraine is one of the ways of promoting stability and ending the war.
Mr. de Hoop Scheffer,
Putin has Crimea. I'm sorry to say, that's a fait accompli. We're not going to wage war about Crimea. Putin has his frozen conflict in Donbass. He has a sort of light switch. He can put it on and off. At the moment, it's more off than on, but he can easily still going on. But I mean, it would turning the argument upside down if that would be an argument that we are not going to associate ourselves with Ukraine. That's putting another premium on Russian misbehavior. It's an argument on the positive side.
In the Minsk agreement, he was supposed to withdraw all his military personnel from there.
Yes, but he hasn't done it. I mean, he started with telling us and selling us the idea that these soldiers were holidaying in Donbass. Well, if I go holidaying, I would do that somewhere else than in Donbass. But anyway.
And they bought their equipment in shops.
And they bought their equipment in shops or online, perhaps. I don't know. But anyway, I've met Putin many times during my almost 6 years in NATO. And let me make a fundamental remark. We go from the assumption, and we did that quite rightly during the decades of the Cold War, that the leadership in the Kremlin was rational. In 1962, Cuba, finally, at the end of the day, Khrushchev was rational, behaved like a rational leader, rational politician. If you would ask me the question, which you don't, but so I'll ask it myself. Is Vladimir Putin, after my what will it be, 14, 15, 16 meetings with him, bilateral. And is he entirely rational? My answer would be, I have, as a politician and as a leader and as NATO and as the West, also to calculate if he's for 85% rational and not for 100%. And that's again linked to deterrence, and that is again linked to, we might have to prepare, and Google Gerasimov and the Gerasimov doctrine, we have to be prepared for other types of warfare, quote unquote, in that near abroad. And when he talks about the near abroad, that includes the Baltic states in the Putin doctrine, and he adds, as we all know, then another part of the doctrine that he will come to the protection and assistance of Russians wherever they are and wherever they live. In other words, that potential 15% irrationality is part of my calculation and should be part of our calculation. And I would rather see, by the way, a Russian economy which is much more okay than it is now, and that's not so much a consequence of the sanctions as well of the drop in the oil price, because the more the Russian economy crumbles, and the more he might be faced with people who say, what the heck is happening here, the more he might be tempted, mark my words, he might be tempted to calculate on that 15% irrationality. He has upset on certain occasions what I thought was reasonable calculation or expectation of an argument, of a discussion. I mean, I realize the NATO Secretary General is not the #1 guest in Moscow, but in those conversations, he could become quite irrational. When he got angry with me, the other interesting feature, he started to raise his voice in German. He knows that I speak German. He speaks German fluently, given his time as a KGB spy in Dresden, in the GDR in those days. We always started the conversation in German, but then, of course, his delegation did not understand anymore, and he switched, of course, into Russian. I simply don't know. I'm not saying the guy is only 85% rational, but I'm not entirely sure.
Did he yell at you in German?
Yes. And then his delegation looked at the ceiling and said, what the heck is the big leader saying to that Secretary General? But I understood, but his delegation did not. Then he got emotional, because he can get emotional on the subjects you discussed with Anne, and we are now discussing. He could become extremely emotional on Bush and missile defense, and even Obama and missile defense. Obama had another way of looking at missile defense in our part of the world. But he gets emotional rather quickly, certainly vis-à-vis a NATO Secretary General. I think my successors will have the same experience.
Very dangerous, even if it's only 15%, to upset the guy.
No.
you're sighing, and but I mean,
no.
I mean, if he is, then
contrary, Yuri, your policy should be, you should be prepared for that 15% potential irrationality, that he is not on the base of that 50% going to do something stupid in the Baltics. And it will not be an invasion into the Baltics, but it might be sophisticated forms of hybrid warfare in the Baltics. And that is something I'm concerned about. I'm really concerned about.
Because he knows how to do that, and he showed how to do that in Crimea.
And there's nothing.
And he knows how to do it here.
And he knows how to do it here. Why? How?
I mean, where are these ideas that all the Ukrainians are fascists coming from in the Netherlands? Who's promoting that? Which internet websites are they coming from?
May I add
that's hybrid warfare?
Yeah.
Okay.
May I add that in the Netherlands and elsewhere, but let's focus on our own country and the referendum on the 6th of April.
Yep.
The media are much more interested in a no than in a yes. A yes is boring, because a yes is reconfirming what a large majority in Parliament already said.
I think it would be a signal to the opponents of democracy, and a signal to the opponents of Europe and the opponents of rule of law and the advocates of corruption, because that's of course what they are, in Ukraine and in Russia, that look, we have some allies in the Netherlands. We thought it was, a faraway country of which we know nothing. I remember that's how they see you too. And yet, look, here it is. It turns out they have, it was very easy to mount a disinformation operation there and convince the Dutch that the Ukrainians are Nazis. And, look how easy that was. So it will be a sign that, oh, look, it's possible to sway a political process in Western Europe. Let's try it again.
And actually, it would tell the people who risked their lives on the Maidan, you are just.
We in the
fools.
Netherlands are having our own. A friend of mine actually, who was on the Maidan and who's one of these young Ukrainian journalists. I saw her about 3 days ago in London. She's been here and she's been interviewing many of the advocates of the no vote. And she says, she was laughing actually. She said, I asked them, have you read the association agreement? And they said, no, And she said, have you been to Ukraine? No. Do you know anything about Ukrainian politics? No. And she said for her it's a kind of absurdity, that there's a serious vote in a serious country.
I'm happy that she's still laughing. It's so callous that
she was sort of
your stomach turn.
Laughing beyond, that it was a debate of, because she's been brought up to believe that here in Western Europe we have serious politics and we have, real political debate, and we make our decisions based on good information, and then she discovers that it's really no better than Ukraine.
There's a question to Mr. de Hoop Scheffer. And Applebaum just said that at the time when Poland and the Baltic states were joining NATO, there was nothing heard from Moscow. They didn't object. Did they ever seriously object? Because in the rhetoric of the no voters, they say, we shouldn't encircle Russia. We shouldn't, irritate them. But is there any real feeling in Moscow about being encircled now? Or is it just rhetoric again?
In my presence, they were always lamenting. Russians are good at playing the victim. All from birthday parties, there always is an uncle or an aunt. The washing machine broke down, the taxi was too late, the grocery shop was closed, and it's all somebody else's fault. The role of the victim, they play in a rather sophisticated manner. But I wouldn't say they objected, but they lamented. Of course, NATO enlargement was part of every and any conversation, but they have never made a real political issue out of it. But they were permanently lamenting. That's the word at that time. Because they knew what was going to happen. It was not a process from one year to another, but again, lots of things happened between 2004 and 2009 in the EU as well as in NATO. Where there was a problem, I must admit, was when NATO had a bitter fight at the summit in Bucharest in 2008 on the membership action plan for Georgia and Ukraine, which was very strongly pushed, as you might remember, by George W. Bush and massively opposed by Merkel and Sarkozy. That led to a bitter fight in that NATO summit. The compromise text was they will become NATO members. That's still official NATO policy. And Putin made it clear the next morning when I met him that this would never happen. And he knew about the fight, of course. He knew how difficult it had been. They will become NATO members without any timing in that paragraph of the communique. So that is something. And then he, as you know, he invaded Georgia in August 2008 to underline what he meant by opposing that NATO communique. And I say again, Putin is a guy who usually enforces his red lines. Yeah, I could echo that. I'm not, because there are people, of course, who say we are not going to vote because then the 30% threshold might not be achieved, because less than 30% means it's irrelevant. I think too, I agree with an Applebaum and Michiel van Hulten that we should go out and vote. Yes, it's too tricky. Not to go and then finally finding out, as I said, that 14 or 15% of the Dutch people has voted against this association agreement, because much more it will not be, even with a 30% outcome, and it might be 32, 33, 35, and then 52% comes up and says no. Is that a representative result from the Dutch people? That is nonsensical. That's why I repeat, the government should guarantee itself the political maneuverability to say, sorry, but we'll stick to the parliamentary majority which preceded this referendum. They will get angry, but that's the price we have to pay then.
Look, in an ideal world, I would love to hear about a referendum on Ukraine joining the EU. I don't think Ukraine is prepared sort of technically and economically and in other ways right now to be an EU member. I mean, being an EU member requires meeting many years worth. It takes many years to fulfill the requirements. Also, I don't think right now that Europe is in an expansive mood for all kinds of reasons that we all know. And so it's not really realistic right now to talk about Ukraine joining the EU, sad though that makes me. I mean, I would love to someday, be part of that debate. So I don't think it's a realistic, from either side right now, realistic possibility. But of course, your question is absolutely correct. I mean, that would be the ultimate way to stabilize the country. I don't think Russia as such is appealing to Europeans. And as I said, the nature of contemporary Russian, I use the word disinformation rather than propaganda, isn't so much to promote Russia or a Russian lifestyle or, Russian corruption. The point of it is to undermine our systems. And because we already have existing in our societies and have always had anti-European groups and cliques and movements and people, it takes very little effort to identify them and offer them small amounts of support. And I'm not really arguing that he's doing more than that, although actually in some countries he is doing a bit more than that. But offering some funding to the National Front or creating a distorting internet campaign here, these are small projects, and of course they are appealing to an existing constituency. He's not, these aren't KGB plants in every country who work for Russia. I'm not making any suggestion like that at all. I'm just saying the Kremlin has identified fault lines in our society and has chosen to work on them.
I would give an answer you might consider a bit cynical, but it's nevertheless I think it's realistic. You mentioned Transnistria, the part of Moldova. That's another frozen conflict Putin has created, Russia has created already for quite some time. You have Abkhazia, South Ossetia and Georgia as a result of the 2008 invasion I mentioned earlier. The realistic answer, I think, is we're not going to wage war for Moldova, we're not going to wage war for Georgia, and we're not going to wage war over Ukraine. They're not NATO members. They will not become NATO members for the foreseeable future. There was even a Pew poll about, I would say, three-quarters of a year ago, where European citizens were asked, what if Putin invaded the Baltic states, because they are NATO members. And I was rather shocked by that result, because there was a substantial number of people who said, well, no, the Baltic states, yes, we know they're NATO members, but NATO should not wage war. In my opinion, NATO should wage war if that happens. But on Georgia and Ukraine and the other frozen conflicts, the West will not wage war, and the European Union might be an economic giant, but is still, to my regret, by the way, a political dwarf, pygmy. So from the European Union, you should not expect any serious military intervention.
The no side is saying we should vote against this, something that promotes rule of law, something that is clearly in favor of democracy, and has been framing it as a feast of democracy to say no. Another part that is very vocal, another organization, is called Forum for Democracy, and is actively defending Putin invading, or Russia invading in Crimea, actively defending these sorts of policies and very reactive.
That's why I'm using the expression disinformation.
But I can understand that disinformation could, for example, give us a wrong conception of Ukrainian citizens or Ukrainian groups, which we know nothing about. But is this also able to completely pervert our idea of democracy, where people are now arguing that Russia should be defended with the flag of democracy, a country that is very clearly not? Do you know any comparisons with other countries?
In the old days, we used to call, George Orwell called it newspeak. You can invert the meanings of words, and it's, It's not just Russian, but I mean it's a technique used in many situations. But I mean, I can't explain why it's worked in this case, but yes, it's extraordinary.
And let me add, I started how I started, that Europe and the European Union, I said how jokingly geopolitical holiday, but I'm very serious about that. Europe, we thought we don't need geopolitics because we have Pax Americana. When it really gets serious, the Americans will come. When we are having an operation in Libya, we can't do it without the Americans. So geopolitics, a balance of power debate. I mean, for the European citizen, that is a very remote, intellectually and mentally, very remote debate. And I'm afraid that both Applebaum and I, as we're sitting here on the stage, will be qualified as I. You have the usual suspects, and that's the difference, of course, and the difficulty, I should say, of the Yes campaign. That we do need also others than usual suspects making the case for this association agreement. Because when I go out and say I'm in favor, they say, yeah, okay, we understand that guy. When I say Europe should not be on a geopolitical holiday, yeah, ha ha ha, the former NATO Secretary General or Foreign Minister says it. So we need to rally people behind us. And I also add in the younger generations and on social media who with us are ready to make that case. But it will take time before this geopolitical holiday is over, I'm afraid.
I'm not sure how come I am a usual suspect. I'm not usually here. But I mean, as I said, it's a trade agreement. It's not a, but yes, I think by expanding European influence and presence and money and investment in Ukraine, you create a better, certainly a possibility for a more stable and secure Ukraine, which, in the future will have wider respect for human rights. I don't think that's an absurd argument to make.